How to get ahead even when no one believes in you. Carl Jung's deepest wisdom. Have you ever felt like everyone disappeared right when you needed them most? That silence, that emptiness, it's not abandonment, it's initiation. Carl Jung believed that when no one shows up for you, it's because life itself is calling you inward to meet the person who will stay, the one who's been waiting all along, your true self. This isn't a story about loneliness, it's a story about awakening. Part 1. The psychological desert. When you realize no one will save you. There comes a moment in every person's life when silence becomes heavier than words, when you realize that the people you counted on, friends, family, even mentors, are not coming to save you. It's not because they don't care, but because they can't. This is the beginning of what Carl Jung would call the psychological desert, a symbolic period where your external world collapses so that your internal world can awaken. When no one is there for you, your psyche begins a silent rebellion. The ego, your outer mask, your sense of identity that depends on approval and belonging, starts to break down. You feel abandoned, invisible, misunderstood. But Jung saw this not as a tragedy but as a profound initiation into selfhood. He believed that the soul has an instinct for wholeness, and when external support fades, that instinct forces you inward. The loneliness you feel is not punishment. It is the psyche withdrawing its projections from the outer world. You see, as long as you depend on others to validate you, your energy remains outwardly focused. You attach your worth to how others perceive you. But once isolation hits, all those external mirrors vanish, and you are left with the raw reflection of your own consciousness. That's when the real psychological work begins. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are beyond the expectations of society or the conditioning of your past. Most people never reach this stage because they cling to the collective comfort of conformity. They stay in relationships, jobs, or beliefs that protect them from loneliness, not realizing that by doing so they are protecting themselves from transformation. When you are alone, the masks start to crumble. The persona, the role you play to be accepted, loses its power. You no longer have to pretend to be strong, kind, or agreeable for anyone. This raw exposure is painful because the ego feeds on recognition. It wants to be seen. But the deeper self, the one Jung described as the totality of who you are, thrives in silence. The absence of witnesses becomes the presence of truth. Many people experience this shift after a betrayal, a breakup, or the death of a dream. They call it heartbreak, but Jung would call it psychic dismemberment. It's the symbolic death of the old identity. When the outer world withdraws its support, your inner world becomes the only place left to turn. You start asking questions that can't be answered with logic. Who am I when no one needs me? Why am I here? What is left? If love, status, and validation disappear, these are the questions that awaken the unconscious. In the beginning, this stage feels like madness. You feel disconnected from everyone. The more you try to reach out, the more isolated you become. But according to Jung, this withdrawal is not regression, it's descent. The soul descends into the underworld of the unconscious, where forgotten memories, fears, and desires lie waiting. This is where you meet your shadow, the parts of yourself you've rejected or denied. The shadow is not evil. It's simply what's been suppressed. Maybe you've always been kind and patient, so your anger got buried. Or maybe you've been strong for too long, so your vulnerability has been exiled. When no one is there for you, these forgotten fragments rise to the surface. You start arguing with yourself in your head, confronting emotions that feel foreign. But this confrontation is sacred. Jung wrote that the meeting with oneself is the meeting with one's own shadow. It's the moment when you stop running and finally face what you've been hiding from. This inner confrontation is not just psychological, it's spiritual. The isolation you feel is the space being cleared for divine intimacy. When people disappear, God or the self begins to whisper. The self in Jung's understanding is not just your higher self, it is the organizing center of your psyche, the image of wholeness placed within you. The silence around you is its voice. There's a paradox here. The moment you feel most abandoned is the same moment your soul begins to speak. You start noticing synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too specific to be random. Maybe you dream of being trapped and then wake up realizing you've been living a life that doesn't belong to you. Maybe a stranger says something that feels like a message written just for your heart. These are signals from the unconscious guiding you toward integration. When you lose external validation, you become acutely aware of your own internal fragmentation. You see the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be. This realization is painful but necessary. Jung believed that true healing begins when you stop identifying with the mask and start integrating the shadow. Loneliness, in this context, becomes a teacher. It forces you to confront your own projections, your tendency to see in others what you can't accept in yourself. For instance, when you feel abandoned, you might project your inner helplessness onto others, blaming them for your suffering. But if you pause and look inward, you realize that your pain is not caused by their absence, it's caused by your dependence. You've been feeding your identity through the reflections of others. Now, with no one left to mirror you, you are forced to see yourself directly. This is where most people retreat. They run back to distractions, relationships, social media addictions, anything to escape the silence. But the ones who endure this solitude experience something extraordinary. They begin to feel a deeper sense of presence. They start noticing that beneath the loneliness there is stillness. Beneath the stillness there is peace. And beneath that peace there is a subtle joy, an awareness that you are not alone after all. Jung called this state the transcendent function, a moment when the tension between opposites, ego and unconscious self and shadow, light and dark, produces a new consciousness. It's like the birth of a new mind, one that doesn't rely on external validation to feel complete. You realize that no one being there for you was never the problem. The problem was believing you needed them to survive. In truth, you were always capable of holding yourself. The solitude that once felt unbearable becomes sacred space. You learn to listen to your intuition, to trust the inner voice that was drowned out by noise. There's something profoundly liberating about this realization. When you no longer depend on others to validate your worth, you become unstoppable. Your energy is no longer wasted on seeking approval. You become internally anchored, emotionally self-sufficient, and spiritually awake. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This privilege begins when you are left alone. The loneliness that once seemed like exile reveals itself as initiation. It's a descent into the underworld of your psyche, where you reclaim the parts of you that were lost, silenced, or forgotten. You start to see that being alone isn't the end of something, it's the beginning of your individuation, your awakening. At this stage, you may feel detached from your old world. Friends no longer resonate, conversations feel shallow, and the ambitions that once fueled you now seem meaningless. That's because you're outgrowing your former identity. You're not broken, you're evolving. The ego is dissolving so that the self can emerge. This transformation is subtle but radical. You no longer seek to be liked. You seek to be real. You stop begging life to make sense and start embracing the mystery. You no longer ask for someone to save you because you understand that salvation is not an external act, it's an inner awakening. This is how you get ahead when no one is there for you, by realizing that you are not moving forward through willpower but through surrender. You stop fighting your loneliness and start listening to it. You let it burn away the illusions that kept you small. Eventually, the same solitude that once terrified you becomes your sanctuary. You become more centered, more grounded, more yourself. You begin to walk differently, calm, confident, unattached to validation. People sense it. They call it strength, but it's deeper than that. It's alignment. Carl Jung believed that the greatest danger to the human soul was not loneliness, but never meeting oneself. When no one is there for you, life has orchestrated that meeting. The silence becomes sacred. The absence becomes your teacher. And in that psychological desert, you finally discover that the one who was supposed to be there for you has been you all along. Part 2. Shadow confrontation. Transforming isolation into power. When the silence around you no longer feels like an attack, but an atmosphere, something extraordinary begins to unfold. At first you resist it, you fight to fill the void with distractions, conversations, or plans, but the more you run, the louder your own inner voice becomes. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That is the essence of what happens in this second stage, the confrontation with the shadow. When you are truly alone, there is no longer anyone to project onto. The faces you once used to mirror your insecurities or hopes disappear, and the theater of your relationships closes. Suddenly you are left sitting in the empty audience of your own psyche, forced to watch the film of your life without actors, only the raw footage of your unfiltered emotions. You begin to see scenes you once edited out, the moments of jealousy, arrogance, fear, shame, or hidden desires you never allowed yourself to feel. The shadow, long exiled from your consciousness, steps into the light. At first, it's terrifying. You see parts of yourself you don't want to believe exist. Maybe you find resentment toward people you once admired. Maybe you notice how you manipulate affection to feel secure. Maybe you realize you've built your identity around being needed, kind, or strong, and without that reflection you feel invisible. Jung said the shadow is not a monster. It's simply the truth about yourself that you don't want to face, and isolation makes that confrontation unavoidable. Every feeling you tried to escape becomes a messenger. Anger becomes the voice of your boundaries. Sadness becomes the echo of unmet needs. Envy reveals your unlived potential. Fear exposes the parts of you that still need trust. When you stop labeling these emotions as bad, you begin to see that they're not there to destroy you, they're there to complete you. In this confrontation, your inner landscape transforms into a battlefield between the ego and the unconscious. The ego wants control. It wants to maintain its identity and narrative. The unconscious wants integration. It wants to bring the rejected material into awareness. That's why this stage feels like chaos. You experience emotional storms for no apparent reason. You cry at random moments. You feel irritable, restless, or detached. It's not regression, it's renovation. The old house of your psyche is being rebuilt from the inside out. Jung often compared this to alchemy. The alchemist sought to turn base metals into gold, but Jung interpreted this as a metaphor for psychological transformation. The base metals are your raw instincts, anger, lust, envy, fear, and the gold is consciousness, awareness, self-mastery. The furnace that fuels this process is isolation. When no one is there to soothe you or distract you, your emotions reach their full heat, melting the hard edges of your ego until the hidden gold within you begins to shine. You begin to understand that the shadow isn't your enemy, it's your energy source. Everything you suppress becomes potential power. The rage you disown becomes courage. The jealousy you hate becomes ambition. The shame you hide becomes empathy. But these transformations only occur when you face them honestly. Jung said that the shadow, when integrated, becomes a bridge to the self, the deepest, most authentic part of you. To integrate the shadow, you must learn to observe yourself without judgment. When you feel anger, instead of saying, "I shouldn't feel this," you say, "This is part of me speaking." When you feel envy, you ask, "What desire in me is still unlived?" This practice transforms emotion into revelation. You stop reacting and start relating to yourself. That's the psychological shift that turns isolation into initiation. In solitude, the mind becomes transparent. You start noticing patterns that once controlled you unconsciously. You see how you've been replaying your childhood wounds in your adult relationships. Maybe you chased people who resembled the parent who withheld affection. Maybe you avoided confrontation because as a child, safety meant silence. In the absence of external noise, these patterns surface clearly. Jung believed that awareness itself is healing because what you can see, you can integrate. The more you face your shadow, the more your energy returns. Each fragment you reclaim, anger, grief, jealousy, pride, becomes psychic vitality. You begin to feel stronger, not because life has become easier, but because you're no longer fragmented. The parts of you that were fighting each other are now allies. You stop wasting energy pretending to be perfect. You start channeling that energy into creation, clarity, and purpose. But integration is not a single moment, it's a dialogue. The shadow continues to test you. You might think you've overcome anger, only to explode one day and realize there's more to learn. You might think you've forgiven only to feel bitterness resurface. These recurrences are not failures, they're reminders that the unconscious works in spirals, not straight lines. Each confrontation takes you deeper, polishing your inner awareness a little more. During this phase, many people experience vivid dreams. Jung considered dreams the royal road to the unconscious. Pay attention in your dreams. The shadow might appear as an intruder, an animal, or a mirror image of yourself. These are not random, they're dialogues between your ego and your deeper self. The unconscious uses symbols to show you what you're ready to integrate. A recurring nightmare isn't punishment. It's a request for reconciliation. As you stay with your solitude, you begin to sense a shift. The same darkness that once felt suffocating starts to feel fertile. You begin to find beauty in silence, meaning in stillness. You realize that your emotions are not obstacles, but instruments. Like an alchemist in his laboratory, you learn to work with them, refine them, and extract wisdom from their chaos. The more you embrace your inner contradictions, the more whole you become. Something subtle yet profound happens at this stage: compassion. Not the kind you perform for others, but the kind that grows naturally when you've met your own darkness. You no longer judge people by their flaws because you've seen your own. You stop seeking heroes because you understand that everyone is battling their shadow in private. Your empathy deepens, and paradoxically your boundaries strengthen. You no longer tolerate manipulation or projection because you recognize the pattern instantly. This is the paradox of shadow work. The more you embrace your darkness, the more luminous you become. People will feel it. They might not understand it, but they'll sense the gravity in your presence, the calm of someone who's no longer at war with themselves. You stop needing to explain your worth because your energy speaks for you. Carl Jung often said that modern people suffer from a loss of meaning, not a lack of pleasure. When you integrate your shadow, you begin to feel meaning again, because every emotion, joy, sorrow, anger, love becomes part of a unified whole. Nothing inside you is wasted anymore. Even pain becomes sacred material for consciousness. You start to notice how your perception of life changes. Before you saw obstacles as punishments, now you see them as mirrors. Before you felt threatened by other people's power, now you recognize it as inspiration. Before you hid your vulnerabilities, now you see them as entry points for connection. Isolation has become your training ground in authenticity. Eventually, a strange kind of confidence arises. Not arrogance, but rootedness. You no longer need constant reassurance. You trust your instincts because you've met the parts of yourself that once sabotaged you. You can sit with discomfort without rushing to escape. You can endure silence without panic. This is what Jung called standing in the tension of opposites, holding both your light and your dark without splitting apart. And from that tension, a new energy emerges: creativity. Once you stop wasting energy suppressing emotions, that energy becomes available for creation. Many people rediscover art, writing, or spiritual practices during this time. Jung believed creativity is the natural outcome of integration. It's the psyche's way of expressing newly reclaimed vitality. You may begin to feel as though something inside you is guiding you, a quiet, steady presence that wasn't there before. That's the self emerging. The more you integrate, the more you align with this inner authority. You stop seeking external direction because your intuition becomes reliable. It speaks in calm certainties rather than desperate impulses. At this point, you begin to transform isolation into power. Power not in the sense of dominance, but in the sense of inner coherence. You become congruent. Your thoughts, emotions, and actions start to align. You no longer live divided between who you are and who you pretend to be. You become psychologically sovereign. This inner sovereignty changes how you move through the world. You start making choices from clarity rather than fear. You stop chasing people who drain you. You stop explaining yourself to those who refuse to understand. You conserve your energy for what truly matters. And because you're no longer fragmented, life begins to respond differently. Opportunities appear not because fate has changed, but because you have. Integration gives rise to magnetism. When you embody your wholeness, people feel safe around you, they can sense your authenticity. You no longer need validation, and that absence of need becomes attractive. But this attraction isn't about ego, it's resonance. The world mirrors back the harmony you've created within. As your relationship with the shadow matures, you begin to see loneliness differently. It's no longer emptiness, it's space. Space for insight, for intuition, for creation. The absence of others becomes the presence of yourself. You realize that solitude is not isolation, it's intimacy with your own soul. Jung often emphasized that individuation is not about perfection but about wholeness. You don't become flawless, you become real. You accept contradictions, you can be gentle and fierce, compassionate and assertive, spiritual and grounded. Integration allows you to hold paradoxes without collapsing. That's what true maturity feels like. When you reach this understanding, the old you, the one who begged for validation, who feared abandonment, feels like a ghost. You no longer resonate with that frequency. You've moved from dependency to self-possession. The approval you once craved now feels unnecessary, because you finally see yourself clearly. The shadow work doesn't make life easier, it makes it authentic. You still feel pain, but it no longer defines you. You still face rejection, but it doesn't destabilize you. You still experience loneliness, but it now feels like sacred solitude. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Once you do, fear loses its power. Now you understand why isolation was necessary. It stripped away your distractions, your illusions, your projections, everything that kept you from seeing your true reflection. It forced you to meet your shadow, to claim your energy and to awaken yourself. And as you walk through life now, there's a stillness in your stride, a quiet certainty. You no longer look for rescue. You are the rescue. You no longer seek light outside. You carry it. The solitude that once felt like punishment has become your source of power. In the depth of your own darkness, you've discovered the hidden Sunday. Part 3. The archetype of the hero rising alone. There comes a moment in every transformation when the loneliness that once felt like death begins to stir with quiet power. Something within you starts to rise, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with an ancient calm. You've faced the darkness, met your shadow, and now a new energy begins to form in the silence, the archetype of the hero. In Jungian psychology, the hero is not the warrior who conquers others, but the soul that dares to confront itself. It's the symbol of rebirth, the force that awakens once you've walked through isolation and survived it. You no longer run from your pain. You carry it like a compass. You've stopped begging for rescue because you've learned that no one else can walk this path for you. That realization, painful as it is, marks the beginning of inner sovereignty. When Jung studied myths and dreams, he noticed that the hero always begins in weakness. There is always exile, betrayal, loss, the stripping away of what was familiar. The hero is never born in comfort. He's born in crisis. His strength is forged in abandonment, and so it is in the human psyche. The moment you are left alone, when everyone you trusted disappears, is the moment your unconscious begins to prepare you for individuation. You become both the wanderer and the path. The hero archetype awakens in the ashes of what the ego once believed it needed. When you've lost the validation of others, when your plans collapse, when you can no longer lean on external identity, something within begins to whisper, "Stand up." It doesn't shout. It calls softly from the deepest layer of your being, from the self, which Jung described as the organizing center of the entire psyche. That voice is your inner compass pointing toward meaning. At first you resist. You doubt yourself. You think, "Who am I to rise? I've been broken, forgotten, unseen." But this self-doubt is part of the initiation. The hero doesn't rise because he feels ready. He rises because there's no other choice. Life has closed every exit except the one that leads inward. As you step into this phase, you start realizing that your strength doesn't come from proving yourself, but from understanding yourself. You no longer chase validation, you start building integrity. The energy that used to go into seeking approval now fuels your resilience. You learn the power of showing up for yourself even when no one applauds. That's what real maturity feels like, doing what's right even when unseen. Jung wrote that the hero's journey is not about defeating the world, but about reconciling the opposites within the soul. You begin to notice how every strength carries a weakness, how every virtue hides a shadow. Your compassion can become self-sacrifice. Your independence can turn into isolation. Your humility can slip into self-neglect. The hero learns balance, not perfection. You begin to feel this subtle shift in your emotional climate. You no longer fear the night. You've made peace with it. You no longer resent the silence. You've turned it into a friend. The solitude that once made you ache now gives you clarity. You begin to feel guided by something invisible, a deep intuitive knowing that doesn't come from logic but from alignment. There's a word Jung used often: self-reliance, but not in the egoic sense of pride or control. He meant psychological independence, the ability to anchor your sense of worth in something eternal within you. When the hero rises, this independence becomes your inner structure. You can face rejection and still stand. You can face uncertainty and still move. You can lose everything and not lose yourself. At this stage, your relationship with fear transforms. You stop treating fear as an enemy and start seeing it as energy, raw, potent energy that can be shaped into courage. Fear becomes fuel. Every time you face it consciously, it strengthens your inner muscles. Courage, Jung said, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. As you embrace this archetype, life starts testing you again. The hero's path is never linear. You'll face moments that mirror your old wounds, people who trigger your insecurities, situations that tempt you to fall back into old patterns. But now you respond differently. You pause. You observe. You choose consciously. Each time you refuse to regress, your new self becomes stronger. You begin to sense that your pain had a purpose. It was never meant to destroy you, but to refine you. The losses that shattered your ego are the very forces that liberated your soul. What once felt like punishment now feels like precision. You can finally say, I needed that darkness to see my own light. The hero's rise is not loud. It's not about public victory or revenge. It's quiet, disciplined, almost sacred. You wake up early not because anyone expects you to, but because something inside you values the dawn. You make promises to yourself and keep them even when no one is watching. You start treating your energy like currency, investing it only where it grows peace. Through this quiet discipline, something subtle happens. Your confidence returns, but this time it's not fragile. It's not built on appearance, success, or approval. It's built on the memory of survival, the knowing that you've already endured your worst nights and still risen. This kind of confidence doesn't boast, it emanates. It doesn't need to be announced because it can be felt. In Jungian terms, you are now embodying the hero's ego transformation, the stage where the conscious mind begins to align with the self. You've learned to live from the inside out. Instead of asking, what do people think of me, you ask, what does my soul think of this? Instead of trying to fit in, you focus on authenticity. This alignment gives you a quiet power that feels almost mystical. When you move from that place, life begins to organize itself differently. You attract experiences that match your frequency of integrity. The right people find you not because you chase them, but because you've become magnetic to authenticity. Your solitude becomes a filter that removes the false and draws in the real. But every hero must learn humility. The moment you start identifying with strength too much, the unconscious will humble you again. That's how life maintains balance. Jung emphasized that the goal of individuation is not to become invincible, but to become whole, to integrate both power and vulnerability, wisdom and humility. The mature hero knows when to act and when to rest, when to lead and when to surrender. You start realizing that every trial was never about proving your worth, but about remembering it. Every obstacle was a mirror, showing you what still needed healing. Every betrayal was a redirection toward your own center. The more you understand this, the less resentment you carry. You stop asking why me and start saying thank you for showing me where I was asleep. This is the quiet revolution that happens inside the hero. You stop blaming, stop comparing, stop seeking external control. You begin to see that the real enemy was never the world, it was your own unconscious fear of power. The world was only reflecting it back to you. Once you face it, the reflection changes. The hero's journey is deeply personal, but its effects ripple outward. When you rise, others feel permission to do the same. You become a symbol without trying to be one. People sense in you a stillness that can't be faked, the calm of someone who has seen their own darkness and didn't turn away. You may not even notice it, but you begin to inspire without words. Your presence becomes medicine. You don't preach strength, you embody it. You don't talk about peace, you radiate it. The hero doesn't tell the world what he's become. The world recognizes it through his silence. As you move further, you begin to redefine success. It's no longer about status or validation. Success becomes the ability to stay in alignment, no matter what happens. It becomes the art of walking through chaos without losing your center. You realize that external achievements are fleeting, but inner mastery is eternal. At this stage, life stops feeling like a series of random events. You begin to see the underlying pattern, the synchronicities, the repeating lessons, the invisible intelligence that guided your path all along. You understand that the darkness wasn't chaos, it was curriculum. Every experience was a teacher disguised as pain. And slowly gratitude begins to replace resentment. You thank the people who left because their absence taught you presence. You thank the failures because they revealed your resilience. You thank the silence because it helped you hear your soul. Gratitude becomes your natural state, not forced but earned. This is the mark of the true hero serenity. Not because life has stopped challenging you, but because you no longer need control to feel safe. You've discovered that your peace is internal. You've seen that you can lose everything and still be whole. Jung described this as the emergence of the self, the unshakable core that exists beneath all roles, identities, and masks. The self doesn't strive, it simply is. Once you connect with it, life flows through you effortlessly. You stop trying to manipulate outcomes. You trust timing. You no longer chase because you understand that what belongs to you will align naturally. The hero at this point no longer fights the darkness. He carries it with dignity. He's not trying to escape his humanity. He's learning to express divinity through it. You realize that every human weakness you once despised is actually sacred. It's the texture of your aliveness. To be human is not to be perfect. It's to be fully awake. And that's the true rise, not upward, but inward. You haven't escaped your loneliness. You've transformed it. You haven't destroyed your shadow. You've befriended it. You haven't become someone new. You've remembered who you always were beneath the conditioning. Now, when you look in the mirror, you don't see the broken version of yourself who begged for help. You see someone calm, rooted, luminous. Someone who doesn't need to be understood to feel real. Someone who has walked through fire and come out gold. The hero's rise isn't about conquering the world, it's about mastering the inner one. And when that mastery happens, everything outside begins to mirror it. You move through the world quietly, radiating a kind of peace that words can't explain. You've learned the secret that Jung spent his life trying to reveal. The outer world is a reflection of the inner one. When you rise within, life rises to meet you. Part 4. Individuation, the quiet triumph of the soul. There comes a point in the journey when the noise fades, not because the world has gone silent, but because your inner world has finally found balance. The storms that once felt endless begin to soften. You no longer feel the same urgency to fix, prove, or chase. What was once chaos now feels like rhythm. You realize that something deep within you has shifted, not dramatically but permanently. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. Individuation is not an achievement, it's an unfolding. It's not about becoming someone new, but remembering who you've always been beneath layers of conditioning, fear, and expectation. It happens quietly in moments of clarity, forgiveness, and self-recognition. It's when you stop asking, "Who should I be?" and start accepting, "This is who I am." After the battles with the shadow and the rise of the inner hero, individuation emerges as a kind of stillness, not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of integration. The parts of you that once fought each other, the light and the dark, the strength and the fragility, the mind and the heart begin to coexist. You no longer try to exile one to protect the other. You understand that peace is not the absence of opposites, but their harmony. In Jungian psychology, the self is the organizing center of the psyche, not the ego, not the mask, but the totality of your being. The ego is like the moon reflecting fragments of identity, while the self is the sun that holds everything together. Throughout the journey, the ego resists surrender. It clings to control. It wants certainty. But individuation is the slow surrender of the ego's dominance, replaced by the quiet intelligence of the self. You start to live differently. You no longer move from fear or obligation, but from inner alignment. Your decisions feel effortless because they arise from a deeper place of truth. You stop overthinking. You begin to know, not intellectually, but intuitively, the kind of knowing that doesn't need to be defended. There's a deep simplicity in this stage. You no longer crave intensity because you understand that peace is stronger than passion. You no longer chase connection because you embody it. Relationships stop being about filling a void and start becoming mirrors of mutual growth. You can love without losing yourself and walk away without bitterness. Jung said that individuation requires a descent into the depths of one's own being. You've already made that descent. You've faced your shadow, embraced solitude, and allowed the hero to rise. Now you begin the ascent not upward toward achievement, but inward toward authenticity. You no longer fear your complexity. You wear it with quiet confidence. At this stage, you begin to notice something profound. You no longer seek meaning. You experience it. Everything becomes symbolic. A sunrise feels like a message. A random conversation holds insight. The ordinary becomes extraordinary because you no longer separate the inner and outer worlds. Jung called this state synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal the unity between psyche and matter. It's not magic, it's alignment. The world begins to mirror your wholeness back to you. You also notice that you're no longer haunted by the past in the same way. Memories still arise, but they no longer sting. Painful experiences turn into patterns of understanding. You begin to see how every wound shaped your wisdom. The very events you once resisted were the architects of your consciousness. This recognition softens you. You stop fighting life and start participating in it. Individuation does not erase pain. It changes your relationship with it. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What is this asking me to see?" The question shifts everything. Pain becomes a dialogue, not a sentence. You stop being a victim of your emotions and start being a witness to them. You allow sadness to move through you like weather, knowing it's temporary. You allow joy to visit without clinging. Equanimity replaces drama. This psychological balance is not apathy, it's awareness. You begin to understand that every emotion is an aspect of life expressing itself through you. You don't suppress or glorify them, you observe. Observation itself becomes liberation. Jung described this as the emergence of the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension without collapsing into extremes. When you master this, you discover a calm that cannot be shaken by external storms. In this space, solitude transforms once again. It's no longer the cold emptiness of exile or the fierce independence of the hero. It becomes companionship with the self. You feel accompanied by your own consciousness. Silence becomes intimate. You begin to sense an invisible wholeness, guiding you, not something outside you, but a presence within. The self has a different rhythm than the ego. The ego seeks progress, milestones, outcomes. The self moves in cycles, in patience, in timelessness. You begin to see that growth doesn't always mean forward movement. Sometimes it means stillness, retreat, or rest. You learn to honor your natural rhythm instead of forcing productivity. In this awareness, you also begin to accept others as they are. You no longer need to fix anyone, convince anyone, or prove anything. You understand that everyone is on their own journey through shadow and awakening. Compassion becomes effortless because judgment dissolves. You recognize yourself in others, the same fear, the same longing, the same divine spark trying to awaken through different forms. This doesn't mean you become passive or detached. It means you choose peace over control. You set boundaries not from resentment but from clarity. You forgive not because they deserve it but because you do. You realize that forgiveness is not about forgetting, it's about freeing your energy from the past. As the self integrates, life becomes less about striving and more about being. You stop needing constant stimulation. You find beauty in repetition, meaning in simplicity, sacredness in ordinary things. Washing dishes, walking alone, sitting quietly, these become meditations. The soul no longer needs noise to feel alive. One of Jung's most profound insights was that individuation reconnects you with the unconscious, not to escape the world, but to live in it more consciously. You don't become detached from reality. You become attuned to it. You move through life with presence. You respond instead of react. You listen before you speak. You love without expectation. This awareness brings with it a deep humility. You realize that no matter how far you've come, you are still a student of the psyche. The journey never ends because the self is infinite. Each day reveals new layers of awareness, new corners of your unconscious waiting to be integrated. But now that truth no longer overwhelms you, it excites you. You're no longer afraid of what's inside you because you've learned that everything within is part of the whole. In the quiet triumph of individuation, success is no longer external validation but internal coherence. You measure progress not by what you've gained but by what you've released. Fear, resistance, illusion. You understand that freedom is not having everything you want but no longer being enslaved by desire. There's a lightness that comes with this stage, not the ecstatic kind but the grounded peace of self-possession. You no longer need to announce who you are. You no longer need to prove your worth. You've become inwardly anchored, and that stillness radiates through everything you do. People feel it, even if they can't name it, the calm certainty of someone who has met themselves completely. At this point, your consciousness expands beyond personal identity. You begin to sense that your journey was never just about you. As Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but that becoming serves something greater. When you are whole, you contribute to the collective wholeness. Your presence heals without intention. Your words carry clarity. Your silence transmits understanding. Individuation turns you into a vessel of balance for the world around you, and yet the triumph remains quiet. There are no crowds, no medals, no finish lines. The reward is the return to simplicity, the ability to wake up, breathe, and feel in harmony with yourself and life as it is. The noise that once filled your mind has settled into music. The conflict that once tore you apart has become conversation. The longing that once consumed you has turned into gratitude. You realize now that getting ahead was never about climbing higher, it was about descending deeper. The path didn't lead you away from yourself, but back home to it. You were never truly alone, only unaware of the presence that has always lived within you. And so the journey ends where it began, in the quiet space of your own being. But this time you see it differently. The desert that once symbolized emptiness now feels like openness. The silence that once felt cruel now feels kind. The solitude that once felt unbearable now feels divine. You have not conquered the world. You have integrated it. You have not become perfect. You have become whole. That is the quiet triumph of the soul, the moment you realize that being yourself fully and fearlessly was the destination all along. When no one is there for you, it doesn't mean you've been forgotten. It means you've been chosen to walk the path that few dare to take. The path of self-realization, of shadow and light, of wholeness. The world might not notice your transformation, but the soul does. Because the greatest victories in life are always silent, and the quiet triumph of becoming yourself is the loudest truth you'll ever live.